History often hides the simple triggers behind world-shaping events. When we look back at revolutions, empires, and the nations they ultimately give birth to, we tend to remember the grand speeches, the battlefield heroics, and the leaders whose statues now stand in stone. But the story of America's struggle for independence, one of the most transformative conflicts in human history, began with something far more mundane. It began with taxes. In the mid-18th century, long before the first shots rang out at Lexington and Concord, the American colonies lived under the comfortable illusion that they were partners in the British Empire. They enjoyed a level of autonomy rare in the world at the time. Local assemblies handled local affairs, commerce moved freely, and although the king's authority was undeniable, its presence felt distant. But that tranquility would soon unravel, not because the colonists suddenly sought independence, but because the British Crown decided that the people in America needed to pay their fair share. The root of the problem lay across the Atlantic, in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War. Britain emerged victorious but nearly bankrupt. Maintaining armies, supplying distant campaigns, and defending a global empire had drained the treasury. When British politicians looked at the map, they saw an empire that needed funding. And when they looked at the American colonies, prosperous, growing, and benefiting from British military protection, they saw a solution. Parliament believed taxation was justified, even necessary. But the colonies believed that taxation without representation was tyranny. This clash was not merely a disagreement over money, but a collision of principles, identities, and expectations that had quietly diverged for decades. To British lawmakers, the colonies were simply extensions of Britain. They were subjects of the Crown, and subjects were expected to contribute to the defense and administration of the empire. But the colonists no longer saw themselves as Englishmen living abroad. America, by the 1760s, had its own social rhythms, its own politics, its own culture, a blend of frontier independence, local governance, and economic self-reliance. They had been left to manage their own affairs for so long that they believed self-government was not a privilege but a natural right. Thus, when Parliament passed the Sugar Act in 1764, tightening trade regulations and imposing duties on imported goods like molasses, it wasn't simply the financial burden that troubled the colonists. It was the principle. The colonies had no representatives in Parliament, and therefore no voice in decisions directly affecting them. To American merchants, sailors, and shipbuilders, whose livelihoods depended on the Atlantic trade, the Sugar Act felt like an intrusion. But the uproar over the Sugar Act was only a faint echo of the storm that followed the next year. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, one of the most infamous pieces of legislation in colonial history. It required that nearly all printed material, newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, carry a government-issued stamp. The tax hit not just merchants but ordinary people, farmers, artisans, lawyers, printers, and tavern keepers. For the first time, Britain had imposed a direct internal tax on the colonies, not simply regulating trade but reaching into their daily lives. The reaction was explosive. Across the colonies, crowds gathered in town squares, newspapers railed against the act, and secret groups like the Sons of Liberty formed, vowing resistance. In Boston, effigies of tax collectors dangled from trees. In New York, mobs surrounded the homes of officials, forcing some to resign before the tax could even be collected. But what made the Stamp Act a turning point was not just the protests, it was the political unity it inspired. For the first time, the colonies organized a joint response. Delegates from 9 colonies met in New York for the Stamp Act Congress, agreeing that only colonial assemblies had the authority to tax their own people. Their declaration did not demand independence, nor did it challenge the monarchy directly. It simply asserted a principle that would echo through the coming revolution. Government derives legitimacy from the consent of the governed. Faced with widespread boycotts and fierce opposition, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. But the victory was short-lived. Almost immediately, the British government passed the Declaratory Act, asserting that Parliament had full authority to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The message was unmistakable. Britain believed the empire was indivisible. The colonies believed liberty was indivisible. Over the next several years, this tension deepened. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed new taxes on everyday goods, glass, tea, lead, paper, and stationed British troops in colonial cities to enforce order. This militarization of daily life only intensified colonists' resentment. Now, it wasn't just Parliament's laws that they opposed. It was the feeling of occupation. Soldiers marched through streets once governed by town meetings. Red-coated sentries stood guard at customs houses. Boston, in particular, became a simmering cauldron of political agitation. The lines between civilian and soldier blurred in taverns, markets, and public squares. Arguments flared. Fists were thrown. And on a cold March night in 1770, the tension finally erupted. The Boston Massacre, as it would soon be known, left 5 colonists dead after British soldiers fired into a crowd. The event shocked the colonies. Though accounts differed on who provoked whom, the image of British troops shooting unarmed civilians spread like wildfire. Engravings, pamphlets, and newspapers carried the story across the continent. The massacre became a rallying cry, not merely against taxation, but against the presence of a standing army in a land that claimed the rights of Englishmen. Yet, even after this tragedy, war was not inevitable. Many colonists still hoped for reconciliation, for a return to the earlier balance of local autonomy under British rule. But the trajectory had shifted. Each new law, each new tax, each new assertion of imperial authority chipped away at the fragile relationship between Britain and America. The final spark came in 1773, when Parliament passed the Tea Act. Its purpose was not to punish the colonies but to save the financially struggling British East India Company by granting it a monopoly on the tea trade. The tax on tea remained, but the tea itself became cheaper than ever. From Britain's perspective, this should have pleased the colonies. Instead, it infuriated them. Accepting the tea meant accepting the tax, and accepting Parliament's right to impose it. In Boston, where resistance had reached its peak, men disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded ships in the harbor and dumped over 300 chests of tea into the icy water. The Boston Tea Party was a direct, defiant act of political rebellion. Britain could not ignore it. What followed were the coercive acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts, laws designed to punish Massachusetts, weaken colonial assemblies, and tighten British control. Instead, they united the colonies as never before. Delegates gathered at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, forming a political body that spoke for all 13 colonies. The issue was no longer a series of taxes. It was the future of American liberty. When the First Continental Congress convened in the fall of 1774, something extraordinary took place. For the first time in history, the 13 colonies, once separate and often competing provinces, sat together as a single political body. Delegates had arrived from bustling commercial ports, from isolated frontier settlements, from sugar plantations in the south and fur trading towns in the north. They carried with them the anger of their constituents, the fear of escalating British control, and a profound uncertainty about what lay ahead. Yet despite their differences, they shared one belief: the Intolerable Acts threatened not just Massachusetts but the liberty of every colony. In their debates, the issue was no longer merely taxation. It was power: who held it, who granted it, and who must answer for its abuse. Still, independence remained a distant idea. Many delegates hoped the Congress might persuade the king to intervene, to restore harmony within the empire. They drafted petitions, organized economic boycotts, and pledged mutual support, but they stopped short of open defiance. Most colonists did not yet imagine themselves as rebels against the greatest empire on earth. They wanted rights, not revolution. But events were moving faster than anyone in Philadelphia could control. In the early months of 1775, tensions in Massachusetts approached a breaking point. British General Thomas Gage, commander of forces in Boston, believed resistance could be crushed by seizing colonial weapons stored in nearby towns. Parliament had already declared Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion, and Gage had been given the authority to restore order by force if necessary. Yet every British move seemed only to strengthen the resolve of the colonists. Militias, ordinary farmers and tradesmen, began drilling openly on village greens. Local committees stockpiled gunpowder, bullets, and muskets. Paul Revere and other writers established networks to warn of British troop movements. The colonies were not yet declaring war, but they were preparing for one. The spark finally ignited on the night of April 18, 1775, when hundreds of British soldiers marched toward Concord to seize the stores of colonial arms. Riders fanned out across the countryside, spreading the alarm. At dawn the next morning, British troops encountered a small group of colonial militiamen on the Green in Lexington. Both sides stood tense and silent. Then, from somewhere, no one knew precisely where, a shot rang out. It was a single crack in the morning air, a moment of confusion that would echo through centuries. The British fired a volley. 8 colonists fell dead. The march continued to Concord, where the colonists, now in greater numbers, fired back from behind stone walls and trees. As British troops retreated to Boston, militiamen streamed in from dozens of towns, firing from hillsides and woods. By nightfall, nearly 300 British soldiers had been killed or wounded. The American Revolution had begun, not with a declaration, but with an exchange of gunfire over the right to control powder and shot. News of the battles spread quickly. Across the continent, men left their farms, shops, and wharves, marching toward Boston to join what was rapidly becoming an army. The colonial militias, once scattered and uncoordinated, surrounded the city in a loose but determined siege. In June, this improvised force faced its first major test at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The colonial fighters held off repeated assaults by British regulars, yielding only after running out of ammunition. Though the British claimed victory, it came at a staggering cost, more than 1,000 casualties. The Americans had proved they could stand against the professional army of the Empire. Hope and urgency swept through the colonies. The struggle had moved beyond petitions. It was now a war. As the conflict escalated, the Second Continental Congress took on a new and unexpected role. It became the governing body of a nation not yet born. The delegates appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, a choice that balanced military leadership with political symbolism. Washington, a Virginian, represented unity, proof that resistance to British policy was not merely a New England problem but a continental cause. Still, even as the Congress raised armies and issued currency, it clung to the possibility of reconciliation. In July 1775, the Congress sent the Olive Branch Petition to King George III, reaffirming their loyalty while pleading for a peaceful resolution. The king refused to receive it. To him, the colonies were in open rebellion. To Parliament, coercion, not compromise, was the only answer. This rejection forced many colonists to confront a truth they had long avoided. They were no longer fighting taxation. They were fighting for political existence. Pamphlets, sermons, and tavern debates burned with new intensity. Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, published in early 1776, gave powerful voice to the growing sentiment for independence. Paine argued that British rule was not a safeguard but a barrier to liberty. Monarchies, he wrote, were relics of a distant past, unnecessary and unjust. If the colonies remained tied to Britain, they would be dragged into European conflicts and denied the chance to shape their own future. The idea that had once seemed radical suddenly felt inevitable. Paine did not merely call for separation, he made it feel natural. By the spring of 1776, colonial governments began instructing their delegates to vote for independence. The tide of public opinion, accelerated by the king's rejection of reconciliation and the harsh measures enacted by British forces, swept the colonies toward a decisive moment. In June, the Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration. The responsibility fell primarily to a young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson, whose eloquent writing captured both the rage of the moment and the hope for something greater. He drew not only from colonial grievances but from the ideas of natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These were not just arguments against Britain. They were the foundations of a new political philosophy. On July 4, 1776, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. The colonies, bound together by years of escalating conflict, proclaimed themselves a new nation. But the document did more than justify rebellion. It articulated a belief that government must derive its authority from the consent of the governed, a principle born not in a palace or a parliament, but in the resistance to unjust taxation and imperial control. The act of declaring independence did not end the struggle, it intensified it. Britain, refusing to surrender its colonies, prepared a massive military response. The full force of the empire was about to descend on America. Yet even as the war widened, the deeper transformation had already taken place. The protests that began over taxes had evolved into a fight for sovereignty. The colonists, once loyal subjects pleading for fairness, now became citizens forging a republic. The conflict would rage for years, marked by triumphs, defeats, and unimaginable sacrifices. But from the fields of Lexington to the halls of Philadelphia, the revolution had taken root. What began as anger over duties and tariffs had grown into a war for independence, guided by ideals that would shape a nation and eventually inspire movements for freedom around the world. By the time the ink dried on the Declaration of Independence, the colonies had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. What lay ahead was not symbolic defiance but an all-consuming war against one of the most formidable military powers on earth. The British Empire, with its seasoned armies, unmatched navy, and vast financial resources, now aimed to crush the rebellion swiftly. For many Americans, the excitement that accompanied the Declaration soon gave way to a sobering reality: ideals alone would not deliver victory. Liberty had been proclaimed, now it had to be defended. Britain's initial strategy rested on the belief that the Continental Army could not withstand direct confrontation. In the summer of 1776, this belief seemed well-founded. General William Howe arrived off the coast of New York with the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever assembled, supported by a powerful fleet under Admiral Richard Howe. Tens of thousands of soldiers, Hessian mercenaries, and Marines prepared to strike a decisive blow. The British sought to seize New York, divide the colonies geographically, and pressure the rebellion into collapse. Washington, though outnumbered and lacking experienced troops, resolved to defend the city, recognizing its symbolic and strategic value. What followed was a brutal series of engagements that exposed the fragility of the American position. In late August, the Battle of Long Island became the first major confrontation after independence. British forces executed a sweeping flanking maneuver that overwhelmed Washington's troops. In the darkness of night and under the cover of fog, Washington orchestrated a daring retreat across the East River, saving the bulk of his army from destruction. But the loss of New York was devastating. British forces occupied the city, turning it into their headquarters for the remainder of the war. The Americans were driven north and west, fighting a series of losing battles. Morale plummeted. Desertions increased. Many questioned whether independence had been declared too soon, or whether the colonies had overestimated their ability to challenge the empire. By the winter of 1776, the revolutionary cause stood on the brink of collapse. Congress fled Philadelphia. Enlistments expired. Supplies dwindled. Washington's army, ragged and exhausted, retreated across New Jersey with British forces in relentless pursuit. The dream of liberty appeared to be slipping into the cold, indifferent waters of the Delaware River. It was during this bleak moment, one of the darkest in American history, that Washington made a decision that would change the course of the war. Instead of accepting defeat, he chose audacity. On the night of December 25, 1776, Washington launched a surprise attack across the icy Delaware, gambling everything on a bold and desperate strike against Hessian forces stationed in Trenton. The crossing was perilous: freezing temperatures, treacherous currents, and a fierce winter storm battered the boats. Yet Washington's soldiers pressed on. By dawn, they marched through the streets of Trenton, taking the Hessians completely by surprise. The victory was swift and overwhelming. Days later, Washington struck again at Princeton. Though small in scale compared to massive campaigns, these victories revived the Revolution. They breathed life into a cause that had nearly collapsed under the weight of defeat. Washington's gamble proved that the Continental Army was not only alive but capable of striking back. Meanwhile, Britain adjusted its strategy. Recognizing the war would not end quickly, London sought to isolate New England, the revolutionary hotbed, from the rest of the colonies. In 1777, General John Burgoyne launched an ambitious campaign from Canada, intending to march south through New York and link with other British forces, splitting the colonies in two. But Burgoyne's advance through the dense wilderness proved slow and costly. American militias harassed his supply lines, cutting off reinforcements. By September, Burgoyne's army reached the area near Saratoga, only to face a determined American force led by General Horatio Gates, with crucial battlefield leadership from Benedict Arnold. Two major battles unfolded at Saratoga, each demonstrating the growing competence of American soldiers. Burgoyne's forces were battered, outnumbered, and increasingly surrounded. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army, a staggering blow to British morale. Saratoga became the turning point of the war, not only for its military impact but for its diplomatic consequences. The victory convinced France that the American cause had a real chance of success. And with that conviction came an alliance that transformed the conflict on a global scale. The French alliance, formalized in early 1778, provided the Continental Army with financial support, naval strength, and international legitimacy. France sought revenge against Britain for lost territory and prestige in previous wars. But beyond geopolitical strategy, the alliance signaled that the struggle in America was more than a colonial dispute, it was a broader contest over the future balance of power. Soon, Spain and the Dutch Republic joined the conflict, not always directly allied with the Americans, but united against Britain. The empire now faced a worldwide war, stretching from the Caribbean to the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. The rebellion in the American colonies had become part of an international confrontation that diverted British resources and reshaped global alliances. Yet, even with foreign support, the war in America remained grueling. Washington's army endured some of its harshest suffering at Valley Forge during the winter of 1777–78. The encampment became a symbol of endurance. Bitter cold, disease, and hunger tested the resolve of every soldier. But amidst the hardship came renewal. Under the training of Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer with a keen sense of discipline and organization, the Continental Army underwent a remarkable transformation. Steuben introduced drills, standardized commands, and professional tactics that lifted the Army's capability to a new level. When the Army marched out of Valley Forge the following spring, it was stronger, more coordinated, and more confident. The war shifted to the south in the later years, as Britain sought to rally Loyalist support and regain control by capturing key ports. Early British victories in Savannah and Charleston suggested the strategy might work, but the southern campaign soon devolved into brutal guerrilla warfare. American fighters like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, used hit-and-run tactics, striking supply lines and vanishing into the marshes. The fighting grew savagely personal, with neighbors divided between loyalty to the crown and allegiance to the new nation. Yet, this southern resistance, combined with Washington's strategic patience and French intervention, gradually undermined British strength. By 1781, British forces concentrated at Yorktown, Virginia, under General Charles Cornwallis. Washington saw an opportunity, and with the support of French General Rochambeau and Admiral de Grasse's fleet, he moved swiftly. American and French forces surrounded Yorktown by land while the French Navy sealed off escape by sea. After weeks of bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered on October 19, 1781. The news stunned Britain. Though fighting continued in scattered regions, Yorktown effectively ended major military operations. A war sparked by taxes, fueled by resistance, and defined by resilience had reached its decisive climax. Yet the story was not over. Negotiations would shape the peace, and the ideals declared in Philadelphia would face their greatest test, transforming revolution into a lasting nation. The world had witnessed an unprecedented upheaval, subjects challenging an empire, citizens forging a republic, and principles born in pamphlets and town meetings shaping the destiny of millions. When the guns finally fell silent after the surrender at Yorktown, the American Revolution had entered its final chapter, but peace was far from guaranteed. The world had changed in ways no one could have imagined when the first taxes sparked protests years earlier. What had begun as a struggle over rights within the British Empire had transformed into a sweeping movement for independence. Now, the challenge was to turn battlefield victory into a functioning nation. As British and American negotiators gathered in Europe to shape the terms of peace, the once fragile alliance of 13 colonies prepared to step onto the stage of world history as a unified political entity. The Treaty of Paris negotiations, which began in 1782, brought together an unlikely team of American diplomats. Benjamin Franklin, elder statesman and public icon, wielded his reputation as a scientist and philosopher to charm and persuade European leaders. John Adams, firm and uncompromising, fought relentlessly for American sovereignty. John Jay, brilliant and cautious, navigated the political complexities that arose between allies as France pursued its own interests. Against the backdrop of European intrigue, the Americans secured far more than many expected. The treaty, signed in September 1783, recognized the United States as a free and independent nation and granted it vast territory extending to the Mississippi River. Britain acknowledged not just defeat but a new geopolitical reality. A republic had risen beside the Atlantic, born not from centuries of monarchy but from the principle that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. Yet independence brought new challenges that were, in many ways, more daunting than the war itself. The Articles of Confederation, drafted during the conflict, created a deliberately weak central government. This system reflected the colony's fear of concentrated power, an understandable reaction to years of imperial rule. But wartime necessities masked the flaws that peacetime quickly revealed. States quarreled over trade, debts, and territorial claims. The national government lacked the authority to levy taxes or regulate commerce, forcing it to rely on voluntary contributions from the states, contributions that rarely arrived. The very issue that had sparked the revolution now threatened to undermine the unity it had created, the question of taxation and who had the right to impose it. Public unrest grew, fueled by economic hardship, inflation, and the inability of states to pay veterans or settle their debts. The most dramatic example came in Massachusetts with Shays' Rebellion in 1786, when frustrated farmers, many of them war veterans, rose in armed protest against foreclosures and high state taxes. Local militias struggled to suppress the uprising, and the event sent shockwaves through the nation. Leaders who had spent years resisting British authority suddenly found themselves confronting the uncomfortable truth that liberty without order could destroy the very freedoms they had fought to secure. The revolution had succeeded in breaking the chains of imperial power, but it had yet to build a system strong enough to hold the new nation together. These tensions pushed American leaders to convene the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. The delegates who gathered there carried the weight of history on their shoulders. Men like Washington, Madison, Hamilton, and Franklin understood that the United States stood at a crossroads. If the government remained weak and fragmented, the fragile union might dissolve. But if it swung too far in the opposite direction, it could recreate the tyranny they had fought so hard to escape. The debates were intense, often heated, and filled with competing visions for the country's future. Yet out of this clash of ideas emerged a new framework, a constitution that balanced power between national and state governments, established an executive branch, created a judiciary, and granted Congress the authority to levy taxes and regulate commerce. The same issue that had once sparked a revolt against Parliament now became a cornerstone of American governance. With the Constitution ratified and George Washington unanimously elected as the nation's first president, the United States embarked on the difficult process of turning revolutionary ideals into functioning institutions. Washington understood better than most that the survival of the new republic depended on trust that leaders would not abuse their authority, trust that the government would respect the liberties it claimed to defend, and trust that the sacrifices of the revolution had not been in vain. His presidency set precedents that still shape American government today: peaceful transitions of power, the creation of a cabinet, and the practice of stepping down after 2 terms. The fragile experiment in self-government began to solidify. Yet the legacy of the revolution extended far beyond political structures. The war had ignited debates about freedom that echoed through every corner of the new nation. Enslaved African Americans saw the contradiction between a republic built on liberty and a society bound by slavery. Women, who had managed farms, businesses, and households during the war, began to question their exclusion from political life. Native American tribes, caught between British promises and American expansion, faced new threats to their land and sovereignty. The revolution had opened the door to profound questions about what equality and liberty truly meant, and who had the right to claim them. These debates would continue for generations, shaping American identity long after the last veteran of the war had passed. Internationally, the revolution sent shockwaves across the globe. Monarchs viewed the American experiment with suspicion, fearing that its success might inspire uprisings in their own realms. And they were right. The ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence reverberated across Europe and Latin America, influencing revolutions from France to Haiti, from Mexico to South America. The world was changing quickly, and the American victory demonstrated that a determined people could overthrow entrenched power. The British Empire, though defeated in America, would adapt and expand elsewhere, eventually transforming into a more global and less authoritarian force. But the revolution marked a turning point in world history, the moment when the Age of Kings began to give way to the Age of Nations. Despite its global impact, the American Revolution remained deeply personal for those who lived through it. The war had torn families apart, split communities, and permanently altered the landscape of the continent. Loyalists, those who had supported Britain, fled to Canada, the Caribbean, or back to England, leaving behind homes, businesses, and the only life they had known. Veterans returned to find fields overgrown, debts mounting, and economies struggling to rebuild. And yet, for many, there was pride too, a sense that they had participated in something monumental. They had fought not for conquest or empire but for a set of principles that would shape the future of the world. In the end, the Revolution's greatest achievement was not the defeat of the British Empire but the creation of a nation built on ideas. The belief that people could govern themselves, that power could be limited by law, and that liberty was worth fighting for became the foundation of the United States. And it all began with taxes, modest, seemingly minor, but imposed without representation. Those taxes stirred a sense of injustice that grew into a movement that became a rebellion, and a rebellion that forged a republic. The story of how taxes sparked a war that built a nation is a reminder that history often turns on deceptively small moments. A dispute over paper stamps, a tax on tea, a clash over trade regulations, these were the sparks that ignited one of the most significant transformations in human history. They revealed a truth that resonated across time: when people are denied a voice in their own governance, they will eventually demand it. And when they demand it together, they can reshape the world.